All right, y'all, welcome back. Today we're going to be finishing up our rear sump oil pan swap on our 1UZ. Now, this engine originally came out of a LS400, which means it came with a front sump oil pan, which was not going to work in our chassis. This oil pan is also on the GS400 as well as the Toyota Celsior. The oil pan we're going to be installing today came off of a Lexus SC400, which is the only Lexus that came with a rear sump oil pan. Now, this may be confusing. As you can see, I do have the oil pan temporarily already installed. Now, it's only being held up there by a few bolts, and it was only installed so that I could test fit the engine and our chassis. Now, with our oil pan out of the way, we can see one of the things that makes the 1UZ such a great engine, and that is that the bottom end features 6-bolt side-bolted main caps, with 4 bolts coming in from the bottom and 2 bolts coming in from either side. This design is what accounts for the 1UZ's notorious strength and reliability. Now, just for reference, I went ahead and threw this front sump oil pan back on the motor. That way you guys can get an idea of what it looks like installed. Now, your chassis may call for a front or rear sump oil pan, and it will all just depend. On our FC, it was not going to work. We had to go with a rear sump, honey. All right, y'all, now that we got our oil pan out of the way, the next thing we need to do is get this mating surface cleaned up and prepped. Now, we're going to be using some brake clean as well as some wire brushes and some razor blades for some of that more difficult RTV. But our goal here is to get this thing as clean as possible, y'all. We don't want any old RTV. We don't want any grit or grime. We want this thing new and shiny. Now, the next thing we need to do is get this pickup tube cleaned up. We need to get all this old gasket material off the mating surface here, as well as we need to clean the pickup portion as well and make sure that that mesh doesn't have anything stuck in there. And we're going to wind up spraying this thing out with a ton of brake clean to get this thing nice and cleaned out. All right, y'all, now that our pickup tube's done, it's time to move on to the oil pan. Now, I've done cleaned this thing at the house and got all the RTV and grease and old oil residue off here, but we still need to give it a preliminary wipe down with some brake clean and then a dry cloth. Now, don't skip too far ahead of me here, y'all, because I wound up making a mistake, and I want y'all to pay attention. All right, y'all, now that our oil pan is nice and clean, we would assume that it's time to move on to applying our silicone, right? Wrong. This is where I made my mistake. I did not realize that the oil pan that came off of my engine actually had thicker diameter bolts running down the side of the oil pan and into the block than this pan that came off of an SC400. Now, I don't know if that's because it's a difference in cars or if it's a difference in years, so whenever you do this swap on your own engine, make sure to pay attention to that. I also wound up having to buy all new hardware because all the bolts would wind up being shorter than the bolts that came out of my engine, so just pay attention to that. So then I had to clean up all this fresh RTV, which made an absolute mess, y'all. But once I got that cleaned up, I went ahead and drilled out all my holes going down the side of my block, and I decided to call it a day after that, y'all. I was frustrated, and besides that, I still had to go to the hardware store, and it was closed. So I decided I would come back and finish it another day. All right, y'all, before we put our pan on here, we're going to go ahead and install our new pickup tube. Now, there is a little paper gasket that goes between the block and the pickup tube, so don't forget to replace that. Otherwise, you'll have low oil pressure. Nobody wants that, honey. All right, y'all, before we put this pan on here, we're going to make sure that we get this mating surface as clean and dry as possible. To do that, I'm going to go around here with a paper towel soaked in some brake clean, and then I'm going to follow that up with a dry paper towel. All right, y'all, now we're ready to put our silicone on our pan. Now, we want to make sure that we do this in as solid and continuous of a beat as we can possibly do with as few break points as possible. Now, once we get this stuff applying, we've only got about 5 minutes of working time before this stuff starts to set up, y'all. Now, once we get our pan up here, we're just going to put a few bolts in just to secure the pan in place while we install the rest of our bolts. Now that our bolts are in place, we can go ahead and torque these down. For our 10mm bolts, we torque those down to 54 inch-pounds. And for our 12mm bolts, we torque those down to 156 inch-pounds. And we try to do this in a cross pattern. Now, once all your bolts are torqued down, you can go ahead and install your oil baffle tray. Now, I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but that's what I'm calling it. But make sure that you install that before you install your oil level sensor, or else it will not go in. Ask me how I know. Once that's done, we're ready to install our bottom oil pan. Now, I've gone ahead and prepped my mating surface and spread my RTV around the rim of the pan. And now I'm just putting a couple bolts in here to hold this thing in place while I install the rest of my bolts. Now, I'm going to follow the same torque sequence as earlier, 156 inch-pounds for my 12mm bolts and 54 inch-pounds for my 10mm bolts. And with that, our rear sump oil pan swap is done, y'all. Well, all right, y'all, I'm done for today. Y'all come back and see me, honey. Bye.